Right, so this is part 3 of my series in which I talk about how society does not respect young men and boys at all. In the first video, I talked about incels and the phenomenon of inceldom. In the second video, I discussed how society does not allow young men and boys to have their own spaces and it doesn't respect the fact that young men have their own specific interests, and it's been actively trying to subvert and trash and ridicule them, as I discussed with Kathleen Kennedy and Lucasfilm, the new Indiana Jones film from last year, and Ghostbusters and all that. But honestly, I mentioned in the last video that society literally does not care. It does not give a shit whether men live or die. And all the examples and the evidence for which I cited in the last video doesn't really cover just how strongly I feel this view. So understand that when I say society does not care about young men, I mean that in the strongest way possible. I mean that young men just aren't getting any kind of respect at all, and society could not, the broader Western world does not care a fig for young men. It doesn't care whether they live or die. And when I say this, trust me that I'm not exaggerating, because, as it happens, there is a rising male suicide epidemic. Now, I should probably preface this by saying, I think there will always be a gap, a gender suicide gap. It's just men have different personality traits compared to women. They are, on average, more impulsive. They're more prone to violence to others and to themselves. They're massive. They're obviously, the crime statistics show that it's a heavily skewed phenomenon. Men are more likely to do crime, and for that very same reason, that men are more involved in crime than women, men are more likely to do harm to themselves. So the fact that the suicide statistics are skewed in the direction of one particular gender over the other is not surprising. But what is surprising is the fact that the gap is increasing. There have been more male suicides in recent years than there have at any point in recorded history, and our society does not appear to be taking this issue seriously. And one of the biggest, perhaps the biggest example, the biggest story about this that I can cite, if you're from the UK, you'll know all about this, because this was big news last year, was in December of 2023. So what happened in December 2023? There was a controversial TV pundit and political pundit and panelist by the name of Laurence. He used to be a relatively famous daytime TV actor, but then he turned to politics, I think, in wake of the EU referendum and Brexit. And since then, he's made a name for himself for giving out conservative talking points on TV, and especially on GB News, where he used to appear as a regular host. Now, he got into trouble because he went on a foul-mouthed rant and tirade against this feminist by the name of Eva Santina. And the words he used were not exactly kind or pleasant. He really went off on one and said, God, who would want to shag that woman? She's a horrible woman. God, she's so unpleasant. And I'm not going to defend the things he said, because they were quite unpleasant. He could have certainly made his case a lot more politely. I'm not going to deny that. And perhaps it's not surprising that he lost his job. And in fact, what he said was so controversial, even the co-host Dan Wootton, who was on that news segment with him, even he got into hot water for appearing on that same news segment, and GB News got rid of him. And there was a massive media furor, everyone talking about how sexism, misogyny, and the patriarchy even it shows up on our TV shows, and we need Ofcom to regulate our broadcast media to show that it's more inclusive, and yada yada yada, blah 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 blah. But and all these stories running the same spiel about how Eva Santina was the real victim of misogyny and all that stuff, in spite of the fact that Eva Santina, her tweet history shows that she has put out similarly dismissive and hateful views towards men, and how she's basically she appears to have, from from what I've deduced, have some sort of transactional view on men and sex. So what Laurence ranted about in that segment wasn't completely off the mark. Anyway, but that's not really important. What was lost in all the story, one thing that none of the stories ever reported, was what was the context? Why did Laurence Fox go off on his foul-mouthed rant about Ava Santina? Well, this was why. It was because a couple days before Laurence Fox appeared on GB News with Dan Wootton and gave his rant, there was a televised TV panel debate on BBC featuring Graham Northcott, an English writer and comedian, and, of course, Ava Santina. Now, Graham Northcott was on that show to promote the sale of his new book, in which he was discussing male issues. And in particular, he was talking about male mental health, loneliness, and suicide. Now, as I mentioned before, obviously, we absolutely should give issues like this a fair hearing, because suicide is no joke. Now, I'm relatively privileged in the sense that I've never personally lost anyone to suicide, but it's not exactly a victimless crime. From what I've seen videos of people who claim they've lost others to suicide, and it's absolutely wrecked them. And I wouldn't want anyone to go through and experience that pain, whether it be a man or a woman. But anyway, how the issue was handled on that debate is something that really is deserving of our attention, because when Graham Northcott brought up the issue of male suicide and male mental health, what did Ava Santina do? She cut in and she interrupted, and she turned it from a men's issue into a people's issue. So she was dismissive about how male mental health is an issue that specifically affects men and not women. Yeah, and I can't remember exactly what she said, but it was something like, yes, but this isn't really a men's issue. This is a people's issue. And, well, this is the epitome. Her performance on that show, by the way, I think it's still on YouTube if you're curious to look at it, but just look at the way that she treated the issue. She was, at best, she can be described as insensitive, because there's absolutely no way. Like, imagine if there was a TV panel debate about women's suicides, and there was some guy up there and said, yes, but I mean, come on, this isn't really a woman's issue, is it? Or sexual assault. Like, I mean, men get raped too. Like, why aren't we discussing that? I think we can all agree that the reaction to such a comment, it would be seen as provocative, and that you're not really engaging in the issue seriously. But that's more or less what Ava Santina did. And this, more or less, what Ava Santina did, the behavior which she exhibited on that debate, encapsulated perfectly the essence of why Graham Northcott was writing his book in the first place. Because our society does not treat men's issues, male-specific issues like male suicide, male loneliness, and male mental illness with the same degree of seriousness that it does for women. And my God, there was another woman, an old, bitter harridan with grey hair, whose name I honestly don't care to remember. And I'm glad I don't, because I'd go on a rant that would make Laurence Fox seem way more polite in comparison, who even went so far as to point the finger at Graham Northcott and said, "Are you being misogynistic? Are you saying that you hate women, all due to the fact that he brought this up?" So, in a nutshell, that's what happened. There was a debate that was supposed to be about male mental health, male loneliness, and male suicides. It wasn't really it wasn't really treated seriously or given a fair hearing by this feminist, Ava Santina, and that was why Laurence Fox went off on his rant. So all the news media, all the legacy print media, and the Fourth Estate in the UK, what did they focus their story on? Laurence Fox and his rant. That's the only thing that made the headlines in this country. All this was cited as an example of how sexism and misogyny is everywhere, and why we need to do more to root out misogyny in our TV. But what did they not talk about? What was missed in the midst of this whole furore? The male suicide epidemic. Now, I actually looked, by the way, at the official statistics compiled by NIS on male suicides, and make no mistake, I think 2021 was the year for the highest recorded male suicides since the records were earliest compiled, so in the early 80s. I don't know if they're the highest that have ever existed in male history, but they are certainly the highest they've ever been since records began. Now, a story like that is worthy of our attention. This is what our outrage should be focused on, but no, nobody gave two shits about that. Instead, what did the media focus on? They focused on poor Ava Santina and her boo-hoo, poor me feelings. This is the epitome of that. If you've ever seen that 4chan meme, men are killing themselves, women most affected. That is basically what happened in December 2023. So there you go. That is, I am not exaggerating. I'm not kidding when I say society does not care a fig for young men and male issues. Male issues are often pigeonholed and regarded as a niche that's not really relevant, neither here nor there to the conversation at large. People don't seem to take an interest in it. It's not given a fair discussion, and nobody seems to be looking into the causal factors as to why men are killing themselves more often. Why is there a rapid increase in male suicides? Why is it that 2021 saw the highest year of recorded male suicide since time began? And keep in mind, 2021, this was a year after the pandemic. So the pandemic alone isn't going to be a sufficient enough explanation. And you've got to bear in mind that male suicides have been steadily increasing over the years leading up to that. So there's been a progressive set of circumstances which have increasingly contributed more and more, leading to the phenomenon that we see nowadays. Well, it's very simple. The fact that men are killing themselves in record numbers in this country, and by the way, I don't believe it's just the UK for 1 second. I think this is happening everywhere throughout the Anglosphere and the West and the Western world. It's very simple. This is really only a symptom. This is a microcosm of a global phenomenon, of the real problem, and that is society does not care about and does not respect young men. Because of all the things that I mentioned earlier, society will not allow young men to have their own personal spaces. Society does not allow men to have pride in being men. There's all these crazy and difficult to navigate rules of social interaction nowadays, which make the modern dating market and the workplace dynamics a lot more complicated than it used to be in the past. There's the abolition of gender roles, which means men and women are competing for the same jobs, and essentially women are succeeding. Women have a huge advantage in modern life because they have all manner of support groups. They have their own recognition of their own illnesses. There's a whole month dedicated to women's history, but there's no month that corresponds with that celebrates men's history. Yeah, I made a bit of a booby in my last video. I talked about how there's International Women's Day, but no Men's Day. There is actually an International Men's Day, but there's also a Women's History Month, and we don't get any of that. We don't deserve our own History Month. Like, fuck off. We invented the modern world. 90% of all human accomplishments, no, 99% of all human accomplishments were made by men. Have you seen how much of a sausage fest the amount of Nobel Prize winners or poet laureates is? It's literally, off the top of my head, I can only think of one female Nobel Prize winner. That's Marie Curie. I can't think of or remember if there's any others, but all across the board, you'll see it's men. Only then can you begin to realize just how much we owe our civilization to men. And we're not even letting them have a month to celebrate their pride in being male? Are you freaking kidding me? Is it any wonder that people are largely indifferent and apathetic to the fact that men are killing themselves more often? And over in the US, by the way, there's a similar-ish phenomenon. which sociologists have written about, called deaths of despair. They've coined their own specific term for it, where men are not just killing themselves intentionally over in the US. And by the way, this is a phenomenon that specifically features in the Rust Belt areas, the poorer parts of the United States, or what they colloquially refer to as flyover country, where there used to be a lot of factories and a lot of mines but got closed down, where there's not a lot of opportunities and a lot of poverty, where so these deaths of despair, men aren't necessarily just killing themselves, but they're living such reckless and hopeless lives where they're addicted to drugs and opioids that they're dying from overdoses and alcohol-based diseases and living reckless lives. Essentially, they're not deliberately killing themselves, but they have so little control and so little investment in their future that they might as well be blowing their brains out. And this is what they refer to when they say as deaths, when they call it deaths of despair. Young men are feeling increasingly alienated from today's modern society because the world just does not give a shit about us. Like, honestly, if you're a young man, you got run over by a bus tomorrow morning, the world would just carry on as normal. No one would talk about it. Your family would be devastated and people who knew you would be upset. But then come a week or a month later, the world will just carry on with its day. It'll be like nothing happened. It'd be nothing like if you're a woman and you disappear. Now, obviously, there's a huge... the media's perfected the art of running big major stories. Every time a woman goes missing, like we had, there was this woman, Sarah Everard, a couple of years back. Now that was absolutely horrific what happened to her. But there are men who go missing too. But does the media really care about that? Do we get the same level of outrage and inquiry that's commensurate with the situation when boys or men go missing? Honestly, it feels like there's an imbalance here. You know, it just feeds into the whole broader problem that society does not allow men to have their own spaces. It mocks and ridicules men's interest. It doesn't allow men to be prideful and have honor in their sex, in being men. It pathologizes traits that we typically associate with normal masculine behavior, like going out hunting for girls and being sexually adventurous, being competitive and ruthless, and being assertive and demanding. It's increasingly unclear how to navigate the minefield that is the modern dating market and the workplace dynamics. A lot of this has to do with the advancement of women's rights and feminism, and it's led to a very skewed and complicated maze of interaction now, which most men are not talented at working their way through, because women by nature are better at understanding what's expected of them and what to say and what not to say in a given situation. But men, as I've mentioned earlier, have more specialized and have more specific areas of niche intelligence and skill. And these needs, these skills, are not really congruent with the mess that is modernity and modern life and the modern workplace and just how society expects us to function. So is it any wonder, in the midst of all this chaos, the fact that men are killing themselves more often, the fact that society just doesn't really care whether they live or die and it treats us largely as disposable, the fact that we used to have in the UK, we used to have coal mines, we used to have factories, we used to have fishing. All these are typically what you would conceive as traditionally masculine, working class, hardy sources of labour and pride and dignity for young men, which were all, by the way, male dominated, and all of these were closed down in the mid-80s and the 90s by Margaret Thatcher, who discovered that we can outsource all this cheap labour to foreign countries where people are willing to put up with more to earn less, where people will live in literal shitholes for $1 or a peanut a day, and we can save money that way. And who cares, right, that the fact that we've got plenty of eligible male workers at home who will be out of jobs. Screw them, right? Because they're men, they're nasty, toxic men, and they don't know their place, and they're poor men. So fuck them. It's the same thing everywhere in the West. We've decimated traditionally male industries. We've effectively incorporated them into what is essentially a more feminized modern workplace. Everyone works an office job nowadays. Either that or they work shitty minimum wage retail jobs, which are unfulfilling. I'm probably going to have to make a separate video later on minimum wage shitty retail jobs later, because I got a lot to say about that. So in the midst of all this, it is totally unsurprising that society is largely oblivious to, ignorant, and hostile towards the phenomenon of inceldom. Because male loneliness, male suicides, lack of male spaces, this is the perfect trifecta that encapsulates modern misandry. The fact that men do not have a stake in society. And there was I saw this interesting lecture the other day by, I can't remember the guy's name. He's an American lecturer, David Eberstadt. It was one of those weird German names, but he wrote this book about how there's a whole section of young adult men, something like 7 or 8 million of them in the US, who have completely withdrawn from the workforce and who are what's categorized as NILF, not in the labor force. They're not only are they unemployed, but they're not seeking work, they're not in training, they're just spending the rest of their lives playing video games. And is it any wonder they're doing that? Society doesn't give a shit about them. Why would they give a shit about society? Fuck society. Have you seen how society treats us? Society won't let us have our own month dedicated to our pride and honor as men. Society tells us to get fucked if we want to go looking for women. Women want nothing to do with us because their expectations are too bloody high and are not commensurate with reality. And society yawns and bats an eyelid when we kill ourselves. And society won't even let us have our own jobs. Fuck off. I fucking hate this world. This world doesn't fucking give two shits about young men. God. It makes me angry. I don't think it's any coincidence either that we've seen a rise in channels of young men who consciously identify as anti-natalists. Men who make an active point of refusing to bring children into the world and see it as immoral. Who can blame them? You know, a lot of the times I feel the same way. Actually, my views on antinatalism and ephilism are they're a bit more nuanced than that and may require a separate video. But yes, so that is my final video in the series where I talk about how society doesn't care about young men, about how society ignores, hates, and ridicules and disregards incels, and sees them as nothing more than a fly to be swatted. Now, young men have no stake in this society. They have nothing to gain from it. Society treats them like they're disposable. Society won't let them have their own things. Society puts women on a pedestal and puts us all in a position where we have to kneel down in supplication towards them. They're incapable of wrong. It's a mess. The twain have never been further apart than they are now. Okay, well, I think I've ranted enough. It's starting to get dark, so I better hurry up and finish my route. But yeah, if you guys feel as strongly about this as I do here, please let me know in the comments section, because I'd be interested to know if there's others who feel as strongly about this as I do. And I'd like to make more videos about this in the future. I bet there's plenty other things that I wanted to include, but it didn't occur to me at the time to talk about because it didn't enter my head. Anyway, before I forget, I'll catch you later.